The summer I learned to mend the old fishing nets with grandfather on the riverbank behind our village. The tar on the ropes smelling sharp as lemon, and the boards warm beneath my palms, is the memory I carry still. The day began with a pale sun that felt like someone lifting a lid off the world, just enough to let warmth spill out. The river wore a glassy surface, broken only by the skitter of minnows and the lazy wake of a distant barge. I could hear the low murmur of birds and the far-off clang of a bell from the chapel, as if the town itself were listening for something unspoken to be decided that day. Grandfather stood at the edge of the dock, his hands a map of weathered lines, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to his elbows, a smear of grease glinting on his knuckles where oil from the nets had dried. He did not hurry me, but he did not rush either. He moved with the river, patient and sure. We laid out the nets on the wooden planks, each rope a dark braid of history and chores, each net a possibility of supper and stories. The scent of tar rose up in sharp, resinous breaths, and the sea salt tang of the river filled the air, though we were inland, not near the sea. I remember the sun catching on the tiny dust motes that rose from the nets as grandfather brushed them clean, his breath soft and even, as if he were teaching a child to say a prayer. The air smelled of wet earth, of rope oil, of something old and honest and a little stubborn, the odour of work that will outlast a bad day. "First, you untangle the mess," grandfather said, and his voice was neither loud nor soft, but exactly right, like the wind choosing a route through the reeds. Then you cut away what's torn beyond repair, and you never rush the stitching. If you hurry, you'll leave strength behind in the fibres, and there'll be a leak when you need it most. He showed me how to find a good anchor point, how to lay the first stitch with a careful pull, how to knot a loop so the net would hold when the fish finally found its way through. I was young enough to believe that a net was simply a thing that kept the sea from taking what it could not hold, but old enough to imagine I was learning something about the world's patience. We began with the smallest repair, a frayed edge where one line had slipped loose. The thread squeaked against the taut rope as I pulled, and the sound rose into a sort of rhythm, the quiet music of making something sturdy again. Grandfather's hands moved with a pragmatic grace that looked almost musical in the low light of the riverbank. Left thumb pinching the rope, right hand guiding the needle, the tip of the needle catching on the fibres with a barely there clink. "Look for the extra slack," he said at one point, not scolding, but with a tenderness I later understood as faith in a child learning trust. If you pull too tight, you'll cut what you're trying to save. If you pull too loose, you'll never make it strong enough. And he laughed softly when I knit a knot that came apart with the next gust of wind, not scolding, but patient, as if to say we'd try again and again until it held. The river began to glow with a deeper blue as noon climbed. The air grew heavier with heat, and a thread of sweat trickled down my temple and into my ear, cool and strange against the warmth of the sun on my back. Grandfather spoke little after that, or perhaps I was simply listening more than I spoke, listening to the quiet authority of a man who had spent a lifetime tying one thing to another until the world made sense in strings and loops rather than in wild, ungraspable thoughts. We took a small break and shared a slice of bread rubbed with lard and a clumsy chunk of cheese that smelled faintly of the smoke-curled wood in grandfather's stove back home. He poured me a cup of water from a dented tin mug, and for a moment we stood side by side, the river at our ankles and the future somehow deferential. Not quite speaking, but listening. The water carried a faint metallic bite from the old boat nicks, and somewhere distant, a child laughed. Perhaps at a boat's wake, or at something only a child could sense and call magic. The world, in its ordinary way, kept offering little miracles. The way sunlight stitched a golden seam along the ripples. The way a dry rope suddenly became a thing that held its own against a stubborn tear. Then came a small moment that defined the day, though I did not yet know it would define me. A rip had opened in a corner of the biggest net, where the mesh was thick with salt and age and habit. I felt the impulse to mend it with a quick fix, to pretend the tear could vanish with a single thread and a stubborn breath. But grandfather looked at the tear as if it were a map to follow, a fault line in the world that needed careful handling rather than a shortcut. He set down the needle, laid his palm over the torn edge, and then, with a touch that was almost ceremonial, showed me how to coax the thread through, not with force, but with a patient, quiet certainty. It wasn't dramatic, the way a single line of thread could be coaxed to meet another line, the way the tension could be evenly distributed so the whole mesh would endure again. But to me, it felt like witnessing a quiet revelation. The tear wasn't something to overcome. It was a chance to mend with care, to earn back the strength we needed through time, attention, and humility. That moment, the steady turning of grandfather's hands, felt almost sacred to me, though no one spoke of sacraments or prayers. It was instruction in a language older than speeches, the language of work, of limits understood, of a community that lives by the careful alignment of small acts. When the net finally lay flat and whole again, there was a small, almost shy triumph between us, the river continuing to murmur its ancient hymn, as if to remind us we had done what needed doing and could move on. Even then, I think I understood that the day's true lesson would outgrow boats and nets. It would come with me, long after the smell of tar and the sound of the river faded from daily life, into the rooms of a school, into the conversations of neighbours, into the way I listened more than I spoke, and how I chose to spend my patience on the people I loved. It is often the simplest manual acts, the way a knot tightens just so, the way a hand steadies another hand, that teach a person where to place their faith. Grandfather gave me that faith, not with sermons, but with the humble ritual of repair, the unhurried click of a needle, the soft rag and the clean line of thread making something stable again. That afternoon closed with a modest supper of fried fish and beans, the river a quiet mirror outside the screenless window of grandfather's small kitchen. The day's heat lingered in the wood of the house, and even the glass in the window seemed to hold a memory of the sun's warmth. A glow that would be there when I walked past this kitchen in years to come. The same light, slightly faded, like a photograph kept in a drawer until you need it. We ate in a comfortable silence that only comes when two people have spoken enough with their eyes and their hands to fill the room with something close to gratitude. I did not know then that the memory would outlast the day, that it would become a compass when I found myself steering through the choppier seas of adult life. Later, when I taught children who believed every problem should have a single, decisive solution, I found myself returning to that riverbank, to the rhythm of grandfather's hands, to the idea that strength is a process, small, patient, sometimes stubborn, always a little stubborn, and that a life, like and get, is strongest when it is mended again and again, rather than discarded when a single thread wears thin. In my own classroom, I learned to listen for the sounds of entangled fears rather than rushing to cut through them. I learned to help a student untangle the knot of a misunderstanding rather than pull them apart with anger.